article that I chose was named Converging on a New Role for Analogy in Problem Solving and Retrieval, when two problems are better than one. It was a study done by Kenneth Kurtz and Jeffrey Lowenstein in 2007. This study were to see if abstracting a problem schema helped promote analogical retrieval and if those schemas must be stored in memory to benefit. Previous studies suggested generating a schematic encoding helps retrieve previous knowledge and facilitates analogical problem solving. There were three experiments in this study, and their focus was to examine analogical retrieval by reversing the usual approach and examining whether comparing two unsolved problems, also known as target comparison, and if it facilitates analogical retrieval of a single previously read story and the subsequent application of that story's solution to test the problems. The first experiment wanted to know if comparing two unsolved problems encouraged spontaneous retrieval and transfer of a previously read analog. Their findings fit with the working theory of problem representation largely determines problem-solving success, which was done by Simon in 1978. The second experiment was to determine how helpful the prompting of finding a common solution was to the participant. I'm focusing on the third experiment, which had 140 undergraduates, and a target comparison, which was one source convergent story, which was known as the general story, and then they had to solve two convergent problems. One was radiation, and the other was the Red-Adair problem. They also prompted the questions during the test to compare problems and then they had to do a matching task. It was also the same as the first two experiments, but they also gave a post-task questionnaire, which had them select possible descriptions that matched their experience while participating in this experiment. And then they had a targets-only group, which had the participants asking to immediately solve the radiation and the Red-Adair problems without exposures to the stories. Comparison suggestion between the problems was made only once. So the target comparison group, which had the prompted questions and story before taking the tests, had a 51% success rate for finding solutions, whereas the target-only group, which only had the test-taking portion with only one comparison suggestion, only had 34% success rate. Therefore, having any explicit instruction to compare and generate a common solution is critical to the success of a target comparison. This difference allows us to infer that target comparison participants were drawing upon the analogous source story, since this was the only difference between the target comparison and target-only conditions. The researchers also compared the questionnaires of solvers, so the people who solved the problems correctly, and the non-solvers, and found that the solvers were significantly more likely to report analog retrieval, so pulling from those previous stories they'd heard. The solvers had a whopping 53% compared to the 15% for the non-solvers. There was also a self-report of analogical retrieval of the source story, and was therefore a good predictor of problem-solving success. The non-solvers were more likely to report independent processing, and so there was 44% for the solvers versus the 8% for the non-solvers. The central finding is that comparing two unsolved problems promotes analogical retrieval. Comparing examples was critical since participants in Experiment 2 showed no facilitation when giving the test problems without encouragement to solve them jointly. The study concluded that comparing test problems facilitates analogical retrieval and not just problem solving in general, since participants in Experiment 3 were less likely to generate convergent solutions without the initial convergence story. This study theoretically implies that comparison-enhanced representation is effective when applying to unsolved problems at the time of test. This study also shows that people do not necessarily have to learn everything correctly the first time in order to achieve successful analogical retrieval and transfer. If they're able to arrive at a more abstract understanding of their problem, they can access previously experienced structural matches that would otherwise have been inaccessible. The second article I found was forgetting of competing solutions as a consequence of analogical problem-solving attempts. This was done by Tim George and Jennifer Wiley in 2021. This study had a set of experiments that explores retrieval dynamics in analogical transfer, specifically the role that forgetting may play in overcoming competition among potential solutions during analogical problem-solving attempts. People have a large number of prior experiences they could consider while searching for a solution. And there are several ways in which retrieval competition may happen while searching multiple sources of information during analogical problem solving. Analogical transfer involves selecting, attending to, and maintaining a specific set of relations while ignoring other relations, needing to suppress irrelevant information that had been maintained in working memory. So while the previous article focused on the best way to retrieve information to facilitate problem solving, this study tests for the possibility of forgetting competing solutions as a result of analogical transfer attempts. The first experiment did not yield the results they were looking for, and therefore attempted it again after adjusting certain aspects of the study. The second experiment was more successful when exploring shared content, which spurred experiment 3 to compare shared context, which was experiment 2, and separate context, which was experiment 1. So kind of combining the two previous experiments and seeing the differences. For experiment 3, there were 173 people recruited via Amazon Mechanical Turk, and participants had to be high school graduates residing in the United States. There were two groups. There was the separate context group, which was like group experiment 1, and there was the shared context group, which was like experiment 2, with a few changes. All participants were read all 3 stories, and the 3 stories were the light bulb, which had the viable solution, the orthopedist, which had the unviable solution, and then the neutral solution was the wine merchant's story. And all these stories were counterbalanced by changing the order of the stories with each participant. Then they were given a filler task, and then a problem-solving task, which was the radiation problem. Then they were told to recall tasks for the base stories, so typing in the missing word. The researchers hypothesized that if an irrelevant solution presented in the same context as a relevant solution produces retrieval competition, then the rate of transfer of the viable solution, so that would have been the light bulb, to the radiation problem, should be lower in the shared context condition than the separate context condition. They found there was a lower recall for the unviable solution than the neutral solution in the shared context condition, and it was not significantly different in the separate context condition. So across the solution types, recall was higher in the separation context condition and with slightly higher recall in the viable solution. So you can see there's significant differences when it comes to the shared context, which means there is a forgetting effect showing up. The results of experiment 3 are important because they additionally replicate the results of experiment 1, which showed no forgetting effect and had separate story context, and experiment 2, which shared story context and found evidence of the forgetting effect. While it also addressed the methodological differences between these experiments. When an unviable solution was presented in its own surface-similar context, no forgetting was observed following attempting the radiation problem. However, when an unviable solution was presented as a part of the same context as a viable solution, forgetting of the unviable solution, the one that really doesn't work out, was observed relative to a neutral solution, one that doesn't play any help. So the transfer rates are also paralleled, the transfer rates also paralleled the findings from the Q recall test that they did. And so the results of the study align with their hypothesis and indicate that analogical transfer may result in forgetting of unviable solutions, primarily when a single base situation contains multiple solutions or relations. So when, just like it said at the very beginning, when we're trying to find something that helps us problem solve, we sometimes forget the things that won't matter to the problem solving.